For our Sunday forum. My name is Leah Case. This is my daughter Charlotte here in the background. We are your moderators today for this forum. I will begin by lighting our chalice and do. There is a glow far off in the distance, a light to which no path leads. We know that each time we help another or join with them to heal the world, each time we stand up for justice and what is right, each time we work and hope and love against all odds, a spark is created that adds to the intensity of that light. We join with others who see and turn toward the glow. As we travel toward that beacon, the underbrush of indifference is flattened and a path is created. More are led to join us and obstacles are kicked away and a road is formed. Many approach the light, strengthened by our works, and we join them to each light a candle. Although many candles are lighted, the blaze never diminishes. We travel out into the world again to light the darkness and begin again. The cycle continues, our work intensifying the glow and joining with others to travel to the blaze and light our candles again. We continue knowing that one day we, or our grandchildren, or perhaps their grandchildren, will no longer travel that widened and trodden path to light a candle, because dawn has arrived, justice is commonplace, and poverty is vanquished, and the beloved community stands illuminated in the fullness of daylight. With that, I would love to welcome Athar Haseebullah. He is the executive director of the ACLU Nevada. He's here to talk to us a little bit about the 2021 legislative session and what's going to happen in the 2023 legislative session, hopefully. Would you like to introduce yourself, Athar, and say a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. And thanks everyone for taking the time to hear from me this morning and hopefully ask some really challenging questions of me. So my name is Athar Haseebullah. I am the executive director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Nevada. By background, just by virtue of background, it's local to Las Vegas. I grew up in Las Vegas, so I'm a Nevada kid. I went to Howard University for college and for law school. It's a historically Black college and university. And the reason why I attended that university specifically was my folks had actually immigrated from Pakistan before I was born. And I kind of came of age during the 9/11 era. And so for a young Muslim adolescent growing up in the States, that was, by many accounts, many Americans' first exposure to Muslims. Before 9/11, I remember we just happened to be sort of like a population center of 1.5 billion people or 1 billion people that were totally unknown to America. And then after 9/11 happened, we went from being the most mysterious, 1.5 billion people you'd know to a group that really received quite a bit of hate. And so around that time is when I started getting more engaged in civic activism. At the time we had just, I think 2 years after 9/11, we'd just entered the war in Iraq, and that kind of instilled in me sort of a sense of what I perceived to be moral obligation to speak on behalf of my community at that time. And part of the reason for that was my mosque that I grew up in was getting voicemails every day, threatening to blow up the building, to kill all of us, all those who were inside. This is obviously really before social media got pervasive, and so there wasn't a great outlet to share your story at the time, right? It was sort of, you just reported it, did your own diligence, and hoped for the best. Obviously, since that time, things have changed. So I really wanted to engage in civil rights work and civil liberties work and figure out how I could be a voice for people in my community, but also people across Nevada who I recognize were suffering from serious disparities across the way. A couple of years after 9/11 happened, my father had gotten sick. Both my parents were small business owners. They're immigrants to this country. They thought they had obtained a wonderful health insurance policy that was going to be the gold standard, because everything in America for a lot of folks is the gold standard. There's no concept that things may fall short at any point. So they purchased a health insurance policy. My dad had a brain aneurysm, ended up in the emergency room for 90 days. This was when I was about 16. The health insurance that we had capped at $100,000, which for an ER stay, as most of you will know, won't get you very far in any era. It doesn't even matter if it's the 2000s, if it's the 90s or any other time, just based off the way the structure of that system works. So upon that insurance concluding, there was a decision made to try to move him into a caregiving facility, which was actually quite terrible. We went in and there was no way for us really at that point to be able to afford care. So my mom and I and my sister spent about a year taking care of him, serving as his caregivers. He was unable to walk or talk. And so that experience of also being a caregiver at an early age sort of instilled in me a duty to be able to help those that might be suffering from the same consequences, for those that don't have health insurance, for those that are watching your family's vehicle being repossessed because you can't afford the payment on it, or for those that just simply don't have the ability to advocate for themselves when you're going and dealing with a big health insurer, and they don't want to hear from maybe a small business owner, or they don't want to hear from a young person. So on my end, I really wanted to focus on civil rights work and civil liberties work. I didn't know in the moment how that would come full circle, but it did. So my final year at Howard University School of Law, I was enrolled in the Civil Rights Clinic. And in the Civil Rights Clinic, I actually got an opportunity to work with the ACLU of Maryland. Just for those that don't know, in law school, you can do something to participate in many schools in what's known as a clinic, and it's sort of like a practicum of sorts. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. I'm not sure whose it is, but the ACLU of Maryland at the time I found to be really incredible. I worked with them on a voting rights case, and it was based on prison-based gerrymandering. And this is the last redistricting session in, I think, 2011, which was fascinating because it was my first exposure to actually doing civil rights work or civil liberties work and working on things like voting rights issues. And, I worked on that case with ACLU of Maryland. I also worked on a case of a female police officer who was working for DC Metro Police at the time and was not being promoted because of her gender. And so those types of issues really, sat with me. They were critical issues. Unfortunately, the economy collapsed, so we all took jobs where we could right afterwards. And so I ended up actually, fortunately, being recruited to work for the city of New York. Started my career as a juvenile prosecutor in Queens, New York, with the understanding that New York was adopting a restorative model for prosecution of youth. Didn't feel like that was the case once I got there. I thought I was going to go in and, be the shiny new kid on the block, just finished law school, did well in law school, the young whippersnapper. Nope. New York does not work that way, for those that don't know. And I got to learn that firsthand. The system was not, there were really strong attempts made by bureaucrats to fix things, but bureaucrats they don't always have the solutions to being able to fix families that are struggling, particularly when the poverty rates are so high over and over and over. And the inability to process cyclically the correlation between poverty and what was happening in terms of over policing in those areas. When you'd go down to Manhattan and I was in Jamaica, Queens, a lot of those same crimes, in my opinion, would not have been prosecuted there. There wouldn't have been stops between law enforcement and young Black and brown youth, predominantly in Queens, that kept reoccurring. I was the only minority prosecutor for most of my time there in the juvenile unit in Queens. Jamaica, Queens, actually Queens as a borough is the most diverse geographic region by number of languages spoken per capita in the entire country. And for me to be the only person of color on our team that was an attorney and watch folks, coming from other areas to prosecute kids was kind of shocking to me. Really great, talented people I worked with, incredibly smart, just not my vision of what society should look like. So a few years after that, I did that for about 3.5 years. I decided I wanted to return to my hometown, in large part because I figured, if I'm getting all this flack here, I'm not even helping my own community. Let me just go home to Vegas and try to see what I can do there. So despite having taken New York and New Jersey, moved back to Nevada, took the Nevada bar as well and passed the Nevada bar. My first few years here, I worked for the Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada under Barbara Buckley as the as a staff attorney there, and I did some of the trainings for junior attorneys there. I got to participate in a lot of community-based work, and it was there that I really understood the process of community-based lawyering. What does that look like if you're a lawyer? How do you impact your community? I also started to recognize the correlation of law and policy, because I started doing cases and cases and cases, and it was like it was never ending, a never ending stream of cases, and most of them were rooted in bad law. And at that time, I had seen her trajectory and seen what she had done, and I didn't really understand how the legislature worked, didn't understand how city lobbying worked, didn't understand how state lobbying worked, but became more fascinated by the notion of using my talent to support policy initiatives as well. So I ended up being recruited to work for the RTC of Southern Nevada as their lobbyist and their in-house counsel. Did that for about a year and a half, I would say. I did the 2019 legislative session with them as their lobbyist. Got to work on some really interesting stuff and build a lot of great relationships, and also understood at that point, started better understanding what happens at the local levels in terms of local policy making, and not just state policy making. We focus so much on state policy making, we forget that a lot of different entities engage in rulemaking that impact people at a very real level in a way that's different than the federal or state level. I then went to a group called Opportunity 180, which is in the educational advocacy space. My focus is really figuring out ways to give students and families a voice, improve the education system, and focus on quality. But then the ACLU position came up about a year and a couple months ago. It's actually election day 2020 that I got the call. I was helping coordinate volunteer election protection efforts here in Southern Nevada for the election. We started obviously receiving a lot of voting rights issues here, which I'll discuss shortly. And they had asked me to apply for the executive director position. Wasn't really interested on my end. I had a really good job before. I was home at 3 p.m. I could work remotely. I was doing well financially, but someone told me something important. One of my mentors had said, just imagine the amount of people you'll be able to help with a platform like that, even if it's for a short time. It doesn't matter, like however long you want to do it for, just focus on how many people you can help, which always sat well with me. So I started actually about a year ago to this date. I started the day after MLK Day last year, so I'm going into my second year now. It's been a challenge. I'm going to share a little bit of information about the ACLU. American Civil Liberties Union is an organization that's over 100 years old. It's a national organization. But within the national organization, each state has its own ACLU affiliate. So I oversee the ACLU for the state of Nevada. Our affiliate was started in 1966. I'm the first minority that's held the position to be the ED there. I think I'm actually the first person who's a practicing lawyer that's held the position as well. We engage and work in a multitude of ways. We do it really through three efforts, though. That's through public education efforts. And when I say public education, I don't mean like, the actual system of education. I mean, we educate the public on what their rights are and what these issues are. It's really public communications and public engagement. The second is through public policy efforts. That means we lobby at the state level, we lobby at the local level. Our national organization really lobbies at the federal level for things like passing a Voting Rights Act or rolling back terrible practices in other areas. And then we too lobby throughout the state, even during the interim cycle. So we kind of get as most of you might know, and I'll jump into that momentarily when I start talking about policy. Our legislature is very short. It only meets for 4 months every odd year between February and May. So you get 4 months to pass laws for 2 years at the state level. It leaves a lot of the rulemaking, the local government. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's not so good. For someone who describes themselves like I do as a civil libertarian, that doesn't mean the Libertarian Party of the United States, right? It means someone who's focused on civil liberties. That can become a challenge when you have all these disparate laws everywhere. The third way that we engage in our work is through legal efforts. When things go wrong, we sue. We're engaged in a couple lawsuits, and which I'll also chat about right now, that are important. Our focus for our lawsuits is really impact litigation. Can we change the law, or can we make a significant impact that align with our priorities, that help move Nevada forward, that protect the rights and civil liberties and civil rights of all Nevadans, regardless of their background, regardless of their status, and how do we advance that together? So that's really what we focus on. I use the term civil rights and civil liberties. So I wanted to make sure I shared with you all what those are. Sometimes people conflate the terms. They're not mutually exclusive. You can use them together, but civil liberties are really when we say civil liberties, we're really looking at the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, what's been constitutionally provided, right? Freedom of speech in the First Amendment, and freedom of press and freedom of assembly, Second Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights to be free from government search and seizure, and so on and so forth. The right to be free from self-incrimination. Those fall under the civil liberties category. Due process as it's applied at the federal level, it's a Fifth Amendment issue, right? Civil rights are the body of law that flow from those civil liberties. And so when we discuss things like equal protection, and a lot of times folks ask, well, why is there a focus on protecting racial minorities or protecting women or protecting those of different economic status when we're dealing with class related issues? A lot of that flows out of the civil rights work. That wasn't necessarily something that was explicated in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Because as you would remember, when the Constitution was drafted, right, there wasn't equal protection for all. That came later. It came by way of amendment subsequently, and then by bodies of law, including the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, and those that continue to emanate therefrom. So a lot of those bridges aren't just spelled out in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It would seem that they are if you looked at the plain language, but courts historically decided before that time in cases like Dred Scott and even Plessy versus Ferguson, before Brown versus Board of Education, which upheld the notion of separate but equal, that these didn't apply to everyone. It was really only after cases came forward like Brown versus Board of Education, which wasn't that long ago when we think about it, right? We're not many generations removed from Brown. That's really when things started to, in my opinion, kind of roll forward when we're discussing what equal protection under the law looks like and the body of law that emanated therefrom. So a lot of us use the term civil rights when we're discussing the issues we work on too, because it's all encompassing. The underlying current, though, I wanted to make sure that I shared that when we say civil liberties, there's a constitutional right to all of these elements. And so they integrate themselves together, which is why it's exciting work for folks like me to work on. We engage in a lot of weird coalition building at the ACLU, a lot of weird coalition building. Sometimes people refer to us as having, our tinfoil coalitions of those that are like anti-government spying, right? Where they view us as being part of this like odd conglomerate of far left and far right that are opposed to, government surveillance. And then we go to issues when we're dealing with voting rights issues and things of that nature, where, sometimes folks end up viewing it in a partisan lens. We're a nonpartisan organization. We're a nonprofit organization. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I'll be able to chat more about that as we're going through some of the policy challenges we had. From my vantage point, if you're not fighting for civil liberties and you're not advocating for the civil rights of Nevadans, that's a challenge for us, regardless. It doesn't matter what your party is. There's folks on both sides of the aisle, I think, have done a really good job on different issues. But that said, I think that, right now, unfortunately, we've entered into a portal within society where every single thing is viewed as a political issue, even science, basic science. And I think one of the challenges we're having right now, and I'm happy to chat about this too briefly, is even with respect to the notion of what happens with vaccinations. It's a tough topic and things of that nature. But a lot of these issues right up until a few years ago weren't as political as they are. We're encountering new challenges than preceding ACLU generations, only because the nature of civil rights and civil liberties as they apply in context of things like social media or internet-based forums or the dark web, or surveillance in different mechanisms, including facial recognition technologies that might even be used by something like your homeowners association. All of these challenges are different. The advent of technology continues to play a role in certainly informing our perspective and determining how we move forward. But at its core, there's a lot more basic elements. My team has offices in Northern Nevada. We have an office in Reno, right across from the airport at Airport Gardens. And we have an larger office here in Southern Nevada. We have about 14 staff spread across our different departments. I work out of our Southern Nevada office. I'm up pretty frequently in the north. Our policy team is primarily based out of our north because of the state legislature and the proximity there. But we advocate everywhere. I'll show up to school board meetings. Doesn't matter. I'll show up to if I have to show up to an HOA meeting, we'll show up to an HOA meeting, right? It's not my preference, but I will do it. So I'm gonna jump in a little bit to the legislative session and what that looked like. Before I do that, I'm going to talk about legal, but I wanted to pause on the front end. I'm going to take periodic pauses just because I want to make sure that if you have a question, everything doesn't come at the end. If you have a question now, though, about the ACLU and kind of the work we engage in or anything I've shared so far, I'm happy to answer any of those questions before I move into the policy space. You can do that if you want to throw your raise hand feature on, if you want to drop something in the chat, or if you want to visibly appear on screen and wave your hands. Any one of the three will suffice.
Can I ask a quick question about about lawsuits?
Yes.
There's one in the state that I think it's from the Department of Justice at the federal level related to children's mental health. Is the ACLU involved in that one at all?
Not as of now. So, but what we can do is, and I can mention a couple of the cases we are working on. When the DOJ, and I'll mention two areas where at least one area where we're working with them, which is with respect to deaf inmates. We're working with the Department of Justice on that particular issue with deaf inmates not being afforded hearing aids. And for us, that's a reasonable accommodation issue, of course, and also common sense from our vantage point. But our docket right now is kind of a mixed bag. There's cases that we litigate on behalf of individual plaintiffs, which are sort of factual, but really what our goal is to settle is to pursue issues that are related to actual changes in law. And so one of the areas that we're doing that right now, we have a lawsuit against the city of North Las Vegas for not holding an election for a vacant judicial seat, which from our vantage point, the law requires they do. You can't appoint judges at your discretion to 6-year terms when everybody else has to stand for election. And that's our reading of the law. We have another case right now that's become a time-consuming related to sort of a party crashing protocol that Las Vegas Metro had in place with respect to those that they perceive to be gang members. But we had an incident a couple of years ago at one of the hotels here where law enforcement showed up and they detained dozens of people and they held them for hours. They made a statement that this was a gang affiliated party, and those people who were unrelated ended up suffering serious damages as a result. Try getting a job after someone says that you're in a gang and they can quickly Google search you. And all you did was show up to a birthday party. So couple of our issues, we have another couple coming forward. We tend to deal with the Attorney General's office probably more than we should at the state level. It's good to be able to work with them to try to resolve some issues. Sometimes they simply can't resolve issues. Sometimes they don't agree with us on the issues. Sometimes their clients, which might be government agencies, may not necessarily always just do what they say. An example of that I could probably give easier is we've been working on trying to resolve issues related to those that are at mental health facilities that are run by the state being involuntarily medicated without a court order, and not in an emergency circumstance, more as a matter of practice because it's a little bit easier, but obviously hasn't risen to the, when I say easier for the provider at that point, because it hasn't risen to the level of seeking a court order there. That's something we jumped in as well on to try to resolve, and hopefully we're going to get a resolution for that one a little bit quicker. On the particular issue you mentioned, not as of yet, but there are other ways that we end up supporting when cases hit a certain threshold. Sometimes we come in as amicus support, which is a friends of the court support briefing that we'll file on specific issues. Normally, the way that we do that is by request. We don't tend to jump in to every issue because I think too many organizations end up doing that. But that's certainly an issue I think that, that if brought to us, we would definitely be interested in considering. You can also mention what our priorities look like along those ways. We recently set priorities for our affiliate. This is the first time we had done this in the state level. We have added things that were not traditionally included within our state level priorities. So a couple of our priorities, I can share what they are now. A few of those priorities, first one is people impacted by discrimination. That might come in a multitude of forms. And so obviously, that goes without saying what that looks like and the ways it can come. So I won't go into too much depth there. Addressing issues related to policing and mass incarceration. And when we're talking about mass incarceration and policing, we're not talking necessarily about individual police officers. We're talking about the system of how we police. Is it effective? Is it working? What could be done better? Are we supposed to be sending police officers to deal with family disputes, or should we be sending mental health professionals, right? And these are issues that we really need to view under a civil rights lens, because they continue to play a role, and we shouldn't have to wait for every officer involved shooting to occur for there to be some sort of demand for reforms along those lines. Another issue that we're focusing on is voting rights. When we're heading into 2022 and we're heading into 2024, the right to vote is sacred. It's a right that should never be infringed upon. It's the basic parameter by which all of us can participate in our democracy. And we recognize, based on what happened in 2020, what we're receiving in terms of the information we've received, that there are going to be serious efforts to undermine and discredit the right of individuals to vote, maybe even intimidate voters into not voting if they're going in physical locations. And so we need to be prepared to combat that on a legal front as well. That's really a staple of what we do. I actually just hired thankfully, due to grant funding, hired a voting rights attorney. It's the first time our affiliates had one. We want to make sure that that right is protected, and it's not a partisan issue. This is something that is ongoing and probably will unfortunately be ongoing forever. Education equity and health equity. Those are two issues that historically have never been ACLU. They were not ACLU issues at the national level outside of individual areas, but we're recognizing that those are the civil rights issues of the future. You want to know why? Because there's 320,000 kids, for instance, in the Clark County School District. Washoe School District is actually amongst the largest school districts for smaller municipalities or smaller areas and counties. When we discuss that at kind of the national level, and we're recognizing kids still aren't getting served. And cyclically speaking, it's year after year, decade after decade, the same conversations happen with why things aren't fixed. And everybody has a solution until it comes time to implement the solution, and then everything falls apart. And so we need to make sure that we're focusing on that from a civil rights perspective too, even things like access to broadband. How many kids did we see during the shutdown didn't have basic access to broadband? What did that do for their learning? And our students with IEPs, were they treated with the same respect? Were they given the same type of education that is required of school districts to legally provide them, even in a moment where there's a shutdown? Or was it simply like, we don't know what's going on and we can't continue to settle for we don't know what's going on, or we'll get to it in 2 years, or we'll get to it in 10 years. And so those are a couple of the other areas we're continuing to work on. And of course, finally, which is not the least important, but probably the one that doesn't need to be mentioned as most on our end, because we continue to do that work all the time, is protecting the First Amendment. That remains paramount. There's constant attempts to undermine the First Amendment. And when I say that, I'm really referring in most instances to government action. That's what we're looking at primarily, but it doesn't mean private actors can't do that as well. There's just different sets of rules that are applicable there. And I think sometimes folks try to correlate, like, well, I have a right to speech, so I can go on Facebook and do whatever I want. That's actually not the way that it works. These are private channels, and a lot of what has historically existed hasn't always coincided with what current affairs look like and what the current nature of messaging in our environment looks like, right? So, but there are issues that could exist with respect to one-sided censorship in certain platforms, and how are certain bodies looking at that? And then we also look at it in other areas in terms of things like free assembly. One of the areas, in my opinion, that I think the state, and if I was at the ACLU at the time, we would have probably moved forward on it. I don't think that there was any real justification outside of economics to allow casinos to open up, but churches and religious worship centers and faith-based organizations to be shut down at the time. If you're opening one, it's hard for me to rationalize there's a scientific basis to shut down the other. One of my friends who's Jewish and I were having a long chat about this because as a person of faith myself, we did not receive a ton of assistance when the shutdown happened, and we had to, at my mosque, we still wanted to make sure that we were being able to, pay our imam so that they wouldn't, necessarily be laid off temporarily, particularly when we're recognizing at that point that so many folks had services. But we unfortunately had a sad laugh at the time because we were wondering if we'd have to host services in a pool on the strip. That would have been the only way to get around our requirements, which wouldn't have probably worked out. And so when I say maybe not a conventional position for someone, sort of my other political ideological leanings, those are kind of the positions we end up taking because we think they end up advancing civil liberties and they're consistent with the nature of what we should be doing. But with respect to those legal issues, if any of those come up, I'm going to share my contact information in a recap email I'm hoping you all can send out so that if anything does come up, love to hear from everyone. I mean, we're really here we don't always have a pulse on every issue in the community, and everybody has a different field of experience. So where we can get involved, we will get involved. With the understanding, my staff's not that big. I think sometimes folks think like I have a couple hundred people at my disposal. We have like 12 people and like 3 or 4 attorneys, but we are able to work with other organizations to help advance interests that way as well. Does that answer your question, Leah? Okay, great. Any other questions before I jump into the policy space? All right.
Oh,
So
there's Jenny Kirsch. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw a hand up. Sorry.
No, you're good. So the 2021 legislative session, I would say, how much time do y'all have? But no, I won't spend 5 hours talking, but I'm going to talk about some of the major things that came out of it, some of the really big disappointments that came out of it, why they were disappointing, some of what the trajectory looks like moving forward and why we think some of these issues are important, and what the future of these issues might look like. So again, to repeat for those that don't know, the Nevada legislature convenes during every odd year from the first Monday in February to for 120 days, and it's 120 days straight. So that's important because at the end of the legislative session, it's not 120 days as in like there's extra weeks given. Weekends count. Because weekends count, it is a short period of time. Even more confusing in certain instances is that you might have an elected official who gets elected 2 months before they go up for the first time to Carson City to serve as a state legislator. And really, each legislator gets a certain amount of bills that they can put forward. What's very, very fascinating about this concept, because it's a citizen legislature, Nevadans, ordinary Nevadans, everybody of every individual background has access to be able to contact their legislature and put forward ideas for them to carry as public policy initiatives. That doesn't mean they'll do it, right? That's not often how it's done. They oftentimes, the way that things are done is lobbyists are paid, or organizations that lobby are paid, and we're able to sort of move forward with policy proposals and shift those. But what's important to note about specifically about the concept of lobbying is you don't have to be paid by anyone to be a lobbyist. You can register with the state of Nevada to be a lobbyist. And I'm happy to come back where probably my team will be happy to come back and do a one-on-one presentation on that too, and actually advocate for the issues you care about before the state legislature. That's a really key distinction from other locations where the ease of access isn't always there. We headed into the 2021 state legislative session with a Democratic majority in the state Senate, a Democratic supermajority in the state assembly, and almost every state constitutional office outside of one, I believe, held by a Democrat. That is unusual to a certain degree, but there is precedent for it. Republicans had recently had majorities in all the houses, and sometimes the flow of election cycles here, because our off-year elections are what's midterm at the federal level for a presidential cycle, is when all of our state constitutional officers are up. The governor, the AG, the Secretary of State. Because of the strong majority there, I think there was an impression by many that there was going to be huge and sweeping reforms during the 2021 legislative session. There were some really significant wins. There were also some really, really significant and, in my opinion, unnecessary, unfruitful setbacks for reasons I still can't fathom, which still haven't been explicated to me, which should. An example of a sweeping change, in my opinion, that's really, really, that really had the opportunity to sort of change a lot for Nevadans was there was the ability to abolish the death penalty here in Nevada. It was the first time that the state assembly under Speaker Jason Frierson had moved forward a bill that actually passed that state house that would abolish the death penalty. And the reason why we want to abolish the death penalty so much isn't because of one reason, right? There's a staggeringly high error rate in those that have been convicted and sentenced to death. The cost of engaging in the death penalty has been enormous because I don't remember if the data is like 10 times or 11 times the actual cost of like litigating otherwise, but it goes on forever. The biggest reason I have an issue with the death penalty is because you have a constitutional right to seek a trial if you're accused of something. If your options that are put on the table are life and death, 99% of the time someone's going to take life because the chance of getting death is bad. So it unnecessarily coerces people into taking pleas that they shouldn't take. In many instances, those that end up sentenced can't afford a high-priced lawyer. They can't afford the best representation that money can buy. Those that are being accused of white-collar crimes aren't sentenced to life in prison or given the possibility of death. Sometimes it's someone who finds themselves in an unfortunate circumstance. Sometimes it's someone who finds themselves with an attorney who might not necessarily be able to represent their interests in terms of their own capacity to be able to stand trial. And so, there's a lot of issues there, but this was really the cycle to get it done. For reasons that remain unbeknownst to me, the death penalty was not abolished. It went to the Senate. The Senate and the governor's office failed to move it. There was back and forth on who was responsible for it and why. We were given COVID as an excuse for why the death penalty wasn't abolished, but nonetheless, from our vantage point, particularly from my vantage point, I viewed that as totally disgraceful. And I don't mince words about that because it should have been. There were promises in advance to have it done. There were statements made that the death penalty would be gone. And rather than working even late until the last day of session to try to figure out a way to even minimize its use, instead of doing that, the entire issue was basically dismissed midway through the legislative session. There was ample time to try to even work out a reduction agreement. Now what's unfortunately happened, which I find to be even more bizarre, is the Attorney General's office, which, and the Attorney General, as well as the Lieutenant Governor, previous Lieutenant Governor Kate Marshall, came out very strongly against the death penalty. They wrote an op-ed about their opposition to the death penalty. They will now be forced, the Attorney General's office will now be forced to defend the use of execution in the state of Nevada. And we're actually suing them on an existing death penalty case for Zane Floyd, where the state's attempting to try a new experimental cocktail, did not want to disclose the drugs that were being used because drug companies also don't want their drugs used for executions. They want their drugs used for medicine. And so there really isn't a justification there, but it's the odd nature of politics where you have an elected AG who's now going to end up having to defend a lawsuit for an issue he fundamentally disagrees with and has been publicly opposed to. It is a bizarre dynamic there. And the reason why is he ends up also serving as counsel for things like the Department of Corrections and other state agencies. That was the biggest setback. There were other smaller setbacks along the way, including what was an odd attempt to criminalize gun possession in casinos, which ordinarily on its face, most people can say, yeah, that makes sense. Why would you want guns in casinos, right? Except the proposal in and of itself was to allow anyone who believed anybody to be carrying a gun to immediately call law enforcement on that individual. So that means if me, a person of color, is sitting at a blackjack table and my cell phone turns sideways in my pocket, someone walks by and they're upset, they can immediately call they can tell the casino who will be required to call police at that instant moment. And what was fascinating to me was we had just spent a year before that discussing the need for better training for police officers, implicit bias training and things of that nature. So I viewed it as totally incongruent. And that's not because I'm saying everybody should carry a gun in a casino. It's because you can't create policies that were tantamount to what occurred in New York under Rudy Giuliani and then frame it as something it's not. Anybody can frame any civil rights violation or attempt to undermine civil liberties as a public safety argument. And that's why there's always issues there in putting things forward, because the first argument that comes back is what happens when the boogeyman gets you? What happens when the boogeyman gets you? But what happens when the boogeyman's the state? They don't mention that in the arguments. And so that becomes a problem there. Instead, what I proposed was why not tell casinos, which had the power to remove anybody that might have a gun anyways, to get security that has maybe metal detectors if they want to. Why can't they do their own things? Why are we subsidizing their policing efforts? What benefit does that serve ordinary Nevadans? Or if the issue is because of 1 October, maybe stop people from bringing long guns in through employee elevators over the course of days. That could have also been used as a preventative measure. So that also was proposed. Terrible idea. I was glad to see that, that didn't make its way through. It just was illogical at every facet of its proposal. But then some really great things happened during the legislative session as well, specifically with Assembly Bill 116, fines and fees reform with respect to traffic tickets. Right now, Nevada had continued for years to criminalize traffic tickets. They're viewed as misdemeanor offenses. When you don't pay them, you end up in warrant status. We've heard story after story about a person who couldn't afford a traffic ticket, forgot they had one, ending up subjected to an arrest warrant or traffic warrant, I should say. They end up arrested as a result of that, and their life is ruined. They lose their employment because they ended up having a traffic ticket that they couldn't afford to get out of. And on top of it, because of that, they end up adding on fines and fees. When we say fines and fees, anytime you get a traffic ticket, you get a traffic ticket, but there's an additional fee for clearing it. When you get a warrant, there's a warrant fee. There's a warrant processing fee. There's a DNA marker fee. And sometimes we had a story, we did 2 warrant quashing events last year, one in North Las Vegas where we quashed about 500 traffic warrants. One recently we did with the city of Las Vegas, which we quashed about 200 traffic warrants. Hard to do because you have to get approval from the court to be able to do that. Court doesn't always love to do that kind of stuff because that's their source of revenue. And they've effectively said such as they make money off of this, which is the reason why it happens instead of it being a crime deterrent. We heard a story from a lady, her husband, she got a traffic ticket. Her husband died at the beginning of the pandemic, about 3 months in. She wasn't able to afford to pay the traffic ticket. She ends up driving, getting another ticket. They don't end up putting her in warrant status yet, but then the first one somehow pings. She ends up in warrant status. By the time she was done, her $180 ticket turned into a $1,500 or $1,400 or $1,500 ticket is what she had told us. And it just kept compounding over and over and over to the point where she's like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do anymore. I lost my husband, can't even drive now. And for many of us, it wouldn't seem like a staggering sum. But once you start getting into a cycle of being a debtor, it's really, really hard to escape from. We view them as debtors' prisons for a reason, because the only way to get out is to pay. And you can't pay because you don't have the income to be able to pay in a consistent fashion. And there's no waiver at the end. There's not the same favors. So Assembly Bill 116 helped remove that. In 2023, that process, and they delayed it out a year so the courts could implement it. That process will end up changing entirely. They're going to move to civil infractions. And so the notion of criminalizing these offenses in terms of getting people in warrant status is going to go away for traffic. We're not saying that somebody murders someone, there should never be a warrant or anything for that arrest. That's not the position. But if someone fell behind on a traffic ticket, to send them to jail doesn't really serve a great societal interest at that point. It does more harm than good for ordinary people. Another great bill that was passed, Assembly Bill 371, Assemblywoman Brittany Miller's bill, passed a requirement that issues related to racism in schools need to be reported and handled distinctly. And when I say distinctly, they can't be treated as ordinary bullying claims. We heard story after story from students across the state who spoke about the interactions they had encountering racisms within their own schooling, and nothing was done. And that was the biggest thing, is nothing was done. There wasn't even data collected to show what that looks like. And so every student should have a safe and equitable learning environment, be free from bullying, free from harm and harassment. So that bill goes a step further than what might have occurred at the local level. While unfortunately, all of our local school boards are kind of dealing with some of the same issues. So, and I'll say they're all challenged, probably with different issues, but because of those dynamics, it makes it really difficult to get things done for them. And so this preempts it, requires that they move that forward. I'll also say that there were tremendous victories across the space in other areas. Sentencing reform or direct file as it pertains to juveniles. Previously, juveniles who were accused of certain offenses automatically had their records referred for prosecution as adults, basically. We weren't treating juveniles as juveniles. And so this did away with about 80% of that. There were reforms in other areas, including in the cannabis space, that created better processes for licensure to allow more applicants that may not meet the definition of what previously licensee had, which was like a lot of money, to be able to get into that space. ACLU National has really cared about that issue because the war on drugs has destroyed communities. It's been entirely destroyed communities. And it's fascinating to see that not but 30 years later, it's one of America's most vibrant and emerging industries, cannabis, right? And so we see it now and we say, wow, 30 years ago, we have people that are still sitting in prison as a result of probation violations for marijuana usage. We have people that are still being accused because they did a street sale of a category B felony. And then on the back end of it, we have investors from other countries now who are making 7-8 figures off of their dispensaries. So it's a fascinating dynamic there as well. Access to, now the thing about access to abortion in the state of Nevada is it's been constitutionally protected, which makes Nevada very distinct from other states like Texas right now, where there's certain primitive laws. And when I say primitive, folks can feel the way they want to feel about a constitutionally protected right like abortion. But when you start as a state subsidizing bounty hunting for constitutionally protected activities, you have went beyond the pale of normalcy. That's not even a thing. So it's not something, it's a first of its kind where, the state has subsidized that type of activity where you have said something's constitutional, but at the same time, we're going to limit it as much as we can. And let's put a bounty on it. Let's go after the Uber driver that's transporting someone to their care provider. And let's assume, which, many of the states do, let's assume that banning something will eliminate the process of it. That's never happened. It didn't happen with books. It's not going to happen with anything else, including healthcare practices. And so, overall, I would describe our legislative session, and I'm going to share the legislative report card that we created inside. We did a scorecard. We evaluated both of the bodies. We initially had evaluated every legislator, but we recognize it's really hard to do an actual and accurate and fair scorecard of individuals, because if you're the leader of a house, if you're the leader of the state assembly, or you're the leader of the Senate, you get to decide what's brought before your body. So how can we score the people who don't get a vote there? Scoring people alone on what they voted on would allow someone, if they eliminated 90% of the bills that were before them and only voted on the one issue that we care about, to have 100% score, and it's just not fair. So really what ended up happening was both of the houses got Bs, which is probably fair. I dropped the link in the chat, but if you scroll down to the page on the actual report, page number 18, 17, 18, 19, and you kind of go towards the end, you'll get down to the overall scorecard in different areas, and it breaks it down by subject specific area. On criminal justice reform, the Senate scored terribly. On housing justice reform, the Assembly scored terribly. And when we say housing justice, we mean that It comes in a multitude of elements that relates to our unhoused population that so many of us do work for in a volunteer capacity, but also to create more affordable housing. It's why it's always a struggle for me to hear in moments like this. We had no idea there wouldn't be any housing available and that we were going to encounter a bubble or bust. How is it that you didn't hear it when we talked about the entire session? Everybody saw it, and we recognize why there are certain caps there and what that looks like and what the challenges are. But framing things as being oblivious to issues really isn't fair. And so overall, gave them both a B, the Assembly and the Senate. The issues that I think were a little bit splashier, the Assembly certainly did better on from our vantage point, from a civil liberties standpoint. But there's still a lot of work to go. So as we look ahead to the 2023 legislative session, we're brainstorming our agenda up. Obviously, we're going to try to bring the death penalty abolition back. One thing I do want to note about the death penalty abolition that didn't get as much attention as it should have, Scott Hammond, who's a Republican senator from Southern Nevada, came out publicly against the death penalty. And when I talked to him about it, my view was based on constitutionality. His view was, he said he thinks it's costly and it's immoral. And from my vantage point, hearing that, and sharing that really demonstrates it, and there should be a recognition that it's not simply a partisan issue anymore. There are a lot of Republicans who want the death penalty gone too, because they think the state shouldn't be engaged in the same practice as well. Oddly enough, those that kept it upheld in the state Senate were Democrats. So it's very hard for me to explain this to my national team, who keeps telling me that, like, yo, you have the best legislature that's going to do whatever you want because they're team ACLU. And I said, just because you're aligned with a party doesn't mean you're aligned with the values of the ACLU. That's simply just not the case. And our positions are not always going to be identical. And obviously this legislative session was a sort of a shining example of that. But Scott Hammond's coming out publicly against the death penalty. And he didn't have a ton of support from his caucus to do it, but he did it. And I think it was an important thing that he did. And his voice is really important to that process as well. He didn't have to do that. I actually live in his district, and the district is not a left-leaning district by any stretch of the imagination. So for him to do that, and do that as a person of faith, he's a practicing Mormon. From our vantage point, it was really important that his voice was out there on that issue. And we're gonna bring up trying to modify and remove the death penalty and change the rules there in a few different ways. I can't give away the secret sauce now, but whether or not there's a Democrat or a Republican office, we should have the ability to have persuasive arguments there. Housing justice is going to come back up. We definitely need to do something about, we're seeing skyrocketing rent prices here in Southern Nevada. And I know this has been the same in Northern Nevada, and it's also been the same in rurals. People's rents went up by margins they're no longer able to afford. And there's no place to go, because when one builder does it, or when one apartment association does it, another might follow suit. And so we're recognizing that the wages are just not going to be matching up to what rent is, and the cost of living has got out of control. And in both areas, finding a home to purchase is sometimes without question a challenge now, because things haven't lasted on the market. The only thing you'll be able to find if you sell your home now is probably a home that you want less than the one you're in right now. And so it's just not that kind of market across the state, but we're still suffering from a serious shortage of affordable housing as well. And so when we talk about dealing with issues related with our unhoused population in both Washoe and Clark counties and across the state, the actual solutions that we need to put in place, we really need to get to and make sure that they're there. I'm going to go ahead and stop. Sorry, I know I went over a few minutes, but there was a lot to cover. And I see one question in the chat that I'm happy to answer. But Leah, if you want me to pass it back to you or Kevin, and you can take whatever questions that you want to come in and field them to me.
I think we were just going to open it for questions. If you want to answer Bob's from the chat on, is the ACLU involved in the Republicans submitting forged documents on.
No, it's actually, that was deemed a criminal issue, and so anytime something comes up as like forgery, it's one thing, but our position is going to be, especially in 2022, I expect a bunch of frivolous lawsuits coming forward, and so one of the things that we want to be able to do is seek fees from those that are filing frivolous election lawsuits. That just hasn't happened, and the second that and I'll use them as an example. The second that a certain media outlet recognized that there was a possibility of a lawsuit related to misinformation surrounding COVID, they changed their tune pretty quickly. And unfortunately, financial ramifications tend to have impacts that sometimes policy advocates just won't be able to engage in at the same level. So we're going to be monitoring all those issues in Nevada, but also our national organization has definitely committed to supporting voting rights initiatives nationally. We want to make sure that folks feel safe at voting sites. And one of the things I'm concerned about is we've seen a lot of protests at individuals' homes. I'm not against that. What I am against is the First Amendment isn't unexpansive and without limitations. You can't threaten to kill someone. There are exceptions to the First Amendment, specifically fighting words, incitement to violence, defamation, and obscenity. None of those are protected. And when we're talking about incitement to violence, if you're threatening to kill someone there, or you threaten to burn down a polling site, which I can see happening, we need to be prepared to see what's going to happen if that happens. How do we make sure that those people's votes are counted much the same? I see Robin's question also in the chat. What is the state national role in supporting the president's voting rights legislation, or does ACLU go to work when infringement happens? No, we're supportive of the Voting Rights Act. We've been pushing for it. I've been in regular talks with Congressman Horsford's office about it to try to, and he's kind of been at the forefront of these issues and speaking out in support of this, and he's kind of like carrying this, and we're incredibly supportive. We need a Voting Rights Act now. We need to stop pretending like things that didn't happen, like 1 billion dead voters somehow voted in the election. All of this is BS. Even the notion of IDing people when they show up to the polls, there just has not been any sort of proof of any of this. Nevada has been conducting absentee ballots for decades. And all of a sudden now, when ordinary people are casting votes by mail, now somehow there's a problem with them. And I never would have guessed that in 2020 or 2022, like the post office would be somehow an issue in terms of like what's politically toxic. It's very strange. I didn't see that one coming, but nonetheless, the post office is ground zero, it seems like, for a lot of a lot of issues that folks are discussing right now. Are there other questions?
I think there's so much to talk about here, and I really want to say thank you. Also, Charlotte says thank you in her own way. I don't know about the rest of the group, but I think we'd love to hear more from you, as the interim progresses and as we get closer to session and maybe even in session, especially, how folks can get involved. If maybe you can leave a chat about how interested folks can help the ACLU's mission if they're interested, and what we can do now, that would be fantastic.
Thanks so much for that, Leah and Charlotte. I'm going to send you an email probably in the next week or so, sharing some of that information. I'll also mention we're a membership-driven organization. The cost of joining our organization is $5 nationally. So you just go to aclunv.org, become a member. It's $5. It'll give you a $35 option, but it's $5. And then you get, by the way, I'm not supposed to tell that. So don't share that part of the recording with my national. They'll be very upset with me. But yes, it's only $5. We try to create a low barrier for entry. And really that just kind of supports the cost of us putting out the tech and the mailers that we send you throughout the year, so you can stay engaged in our work. But I'll be sharing a recap email as well. We're going to need your advocacy and support in 2023. And we're probably going to need it, honestly, in 2022 when it comes down to getting some more election protection efforts in place. I remain probably more doomsday paranoid than most about election 2022 in terms of from a voting rights perspective. The outcome is what the outcome will be. Whatever, that's like beyond my control, but I don't want to see anybody's right to vote castigated. And that to me remains a terrifying proposition. I can easily envision a scenario where at a Black voting site here in Southern Nevada, and I can think of the one specifically, I can imagine armed protesters outside saying burn it down, and it'll be a reminder of the 60s. And I don't want us to be in a position where we say on the back end in December of 2022, we didn't know it was coming. We know that there's a possibility of it coming, so we need to be prepared for what that looks like. And we can't simply accept potentials as being some sort of hypothetical that has no viability. This is a trend that's occurring nationally, and if people are afraid at that moment, and you recognize that if I wait in this line, I might actually get killed, and the only thing that's going to happen is someone's going to show up to write a report about what happened and take a picture of my dead body, you're not staying at that voting site. And that is terrifying, and it really destroys, it has the opportunity to destroy faith in future election cycles. So we need to get ahead of it, and we'll need your support as well as the support of a lot of other organizations to be able to do that. This really should never be a partisan issue, and that's the most challenging part. Is like, this is basic human decency and human life, and we don't want to see that threatened.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. That's terrifying. We are at 10 o'clock. Kevin, does that mean we have to jump off? Is that okay?
It does. So, Athar, thank you very, very much for an outstanding presentation. You just barreled right through it. So I think we need to take a look at the report that you cited in the chat box, and maybe we'll have you back for more questions.
Anytime. My pleasure. Thank you all again for having me on. Thank you for what you do in the community. I know each of you does respective work in different pockets throughout the community, and that's really important. And so for people who are, frontline supporters of the different communities that we serve, whether that's the unhoused or those in academics or those with disabilities and everything in between, just thank you for all of your service respectively. And I appreciate you taking the time to even take an hour on Sunday to listen to me.
Good.